class. Welcome to Social Problems again. This is Chapter 6, Problems in Education. Education plays a very vital role in our society. Without education, we would leave up to chance things that we can ensure that is passed down from generation to generation. We don't want to invent the proverbial wheel over and over again. So what we do is we pass the knowledge of the wheel, the concept of the wheel, and the technology of the wheel itself through an institution we call education. So, in sum, education ensures the transmission of knowledge, technology, and skills from one generation to the next. So, education can be functional for society. That with education we ensure that society perpetuates itself. The functions of education ensure that society has continuity from one generation to the next. That could lead to the development of the social order and the development of society. So it's important for us to have the educational institution. It can be functional, maintain the order and the normal functioning of society. Education can also be dysfunctional. Education can teach us in terms of the important knowledge and skills that are vital to society. But also, we can be too educated in one area, overeducated in the technical aspects of society, and we leave out the social elements of society. We can be so heavily trained in one particular discipline of education, and we're so heavily trained in sociology that we fail to recognize the legitimate contributions of other disciplines like psychology, like anthropology, like all of the other disciplines in the academic arena. So education can be functional or dysfunctional for society. Education is also complex. There is a micro level in which we can examine education, where learning actually takes place in the classroom with students and with teachers and with the content of courses and the ways in which people are evaluated, that performance is evaluated in education on a micro level. We can also look at education on an institutional level. We can look at how education as an institution interacts with all of the other institutions of society. We can look at the difference between elementary education, secondary education, post-secondary, higher education, and professional education. So education can be looked at as a very complex institution of society. There are interconnections between education and all other institutions of society. In sociology, we basically acknowledge that there are 5 institutions of society: political, the economic, education, religion, and the family. And there are others that tend to add institutions like the media, like the internet. Those things also have an influence upon people and society as well. But education, you should know, is embedded in a larger social and institutional environment. So education is influenced by economics. It's influenced by politics. It's influenced by religion and the family and the media. All of these things have an influence upon education as an institution in society. So, as a social system, society composed of these various institutions of society, economic, political, religion, education, family, all of these institutions, you should know that a change in one area of society can affect change throughout society. So we could say that a change in the economic institutions of society or in the economy can affect education. That's why we have lower funding to education. That's why teachers are often underpaid. They're not paid competitively in comparison to the larger society. So we can see how education is part of a larger social system in society. And a change in education can affect other institutions as well. So you'll see in one of the slides, you'll see a picture of the political, economic, religion, and family on education, sort of a diagram to that effect. Education as an institution of society is composed of bureaucratic organizations. The concept of bureaucracy was developed by the German sociologist Max Weber. And bureaucratic organizations are assumed to be the most efficient way to accomplish complex tasks in society. So bureaucracies are designed and they operate to accomplish very complex goals, and education being one of them. Preparing people to meet the various needs within society. They're taught knowledge, they're taught skills, they're given information for doctors and lawyers and teachers and businessmen and businesswomen in society. Bureaucratic organizations tend to be highly efficient. Another way of saying efficient would be doing things right. So education as a bureaucracy emphasizes efficiency. And in being efficient translates into serving the greatest number of people at the limited amount of, using the limited amount of resources like cost, like time, like technology. All of these things add to the efficiency of bureaucratic organizations like education. One of the limitations, however, is that bureaucratic organizations are not always effective. That means they don't always accomplish their goals. They tend to perpetuate themselves. They're very efficient. They can measure their productivity and their efficiency, but don't always accomplish the goals that they set for themselves. Bureaucratic organizations also tend to be very utilitarian. They are more task-oriented. You might hear people say things in these organizations, getting the job done, or we want results. So very result-oriented is the nature of bureaucratic organizations. And then we also have bureaucratic organizations are rational. That means that they are very purposeful and intentional. They don't leave anything up to chance, you might say. Max Weber, in his development of the concept of bureaucracy, developed a methodology known as the ideal type. So he created a number of factors that contribute to our understanding and observation and analysis of bureaucratic organizations. So there's 6 features of a bureaucracy. One is that bureaucracies are hierarchical. They are arranged from top to bottom, somewhat like a pyramid or a ladder. And you have people at the top who tend to have the power, who tend to make the major decisions, they make the big bucks. And then you have people down at the bottom who tend to do the majority of the work, who tend to be underpaid and overworked. So you have this hierarchical structure associated with bureaucratic organizations. Second of all, specialization is a key factor in bureaucratic organizations. That means everyone has a specific task or role to play in the organization. And they ensure that certain tasks are performed in order to contribute to the efficiency of a bureaucratic organization. Third, there are formal rules and regulations. Some of you may be familiar with SOP, or standard operating procedures, that there are very strict rules to follow in terms of the tasks that are performed in an organization that is bureaucratic in nature. Then there are written communications, that face-to-face interaction is not valued within bureaucratic organization. It's all about the paperwork. You may have heard of the term bureaucratic red tape. And that concept came from England, where they used to archive information and wrap it in red tape. And so the idea of all of the paperwork, all the trees we kill in order to justify having all the paperwork that we use in bureaucratic organization. Then there's technical competence. Technical competence has to do with a way to measure and hold people accountable for their ability to perform their roles within an organization. And last of all, there's impersonality. Bureaucratic organizations pride themselves because they treat everyone in the same way, like dirt. No, not exactly like dirt, but not impersonally, that you're not treated as an individual, you're treated as a customer, you're treated as a client, but you're not treated as a whole person. And that way, based on this assumption, bureaucratic organizations do not discriminate. They treat everyone the same, but don't expect any friendship or any love affair with bureaucratic organizations. Most people have a very negative experience with bureaucratic organizations and feel like cattle being herded through a pasture or something like that. They even have these mazes. I remember going to the DMV in California. It's like a little maze, and they have everyone going around the little maze to get to the counter. So those are the 6 features of bureaucratic organizations, and they have their advantages. They also have their limitations. Bureaucratic organizations are very efficient, but not always effective. Educational institutions are bureaucratic, but there are advantages to bureaucracy, and the advantage is that they are highly efficient. They are the most efficient way to use resources, and those resources could be in the form of human resources, financial resources, technologies. All of these resources are brought together in bureaucratic organizations to accomplish their goals. So in education, instruction, the generation of knowledge through research, all of this is part of the goals of educational institutions, and bureaucratic organizations are very efficient in that regard. Also, bureaucracies are very good at serving large numbers of people. So the only way to do this efficiently is to have an organization that's bureaucratic in nature. And so just like, for example, the military, where you have soldiers, and soldiers, their activities are regimented, they are organized, they are planned, and it is the most efficient way to deal with large numbers of people, like in the military. The disadvantage of bureaucratic organizations is that they're impersonal, that you lose your individuality. Your personal needs and your personal goals are not considered when it comes to strictly bureaucratic organizations. And there also is a problem of over-specialization, where people are so specialized that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and there was a problem with communicating across departments, across agencies, in academia, across disciplines and subjects. It's very difficult to coordinate those activities because of the over-specialization. You know, me as a sociologist, I know more about sociology, I know little about psychology or anthropology or education or all of the other disciplines, and so therefore this leads to paradigms, and these paradigms create divisions and makes us ineffective in terms of education, but we're yet more efficient when it comes to our specific disciplines. What are the challenges for educational institutions that are bureaucratic in nature? There is a need for schools, colleges, and universities to be more humanized. Well, I know there are humans in it, but organizations don't always treat other human beings in those organizations as whole people. Elton Mayo developed what's known as the Human Relations School. He was more focused upon industrial factories, companies. He was facing sort of this climate where scientific management was, Frederick Taylor was the paradigm of the day, that people were basically treated like extensions of technology, extensions of the production process, and it was less human. Humans had to work around the technology instead of technologies enhancing their behavior. That will come much later with something called ergonomics that made things more user-friendly, more human-friendly. So one of the ways that educational institutions can become less bureaucratic and more humanized is creating a sense of community within these educational institutions, that you have areas where people can actually socialize. You have areas where people can actually study and learn in very relaxed environments. You know, in ancient times, when the old teachers, like the old philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they didn't teach in classrooms with blackboards. They actually walked around in the community and through the fields, and that's how they learned. It was a much different learning environment. I'm not recommending that we do that, and it may not be practical or possible to do so, but there are ways in which schools and colleges and universities can create more community for groups on campus. And then there's what's known as learning groups. There tends to be a tendency for schools, colleges, universities to have individual competition when it comes to education. That everyone studies along, they perform their tests individually, and it's sort of an individualized competition. One of the ways to humanize education is to bring students together as a group, but also faculty as a group, administrators as groups, and to see themselves as part of something larger than themselves rather than a person who has to work and perform independently. Now, I know that there are levels where people must have integrity. We must maintain integrity in terms of testing and things of that nature. But there are also ways in which we can create more of a sense of community and create these learning groups where, and professional groups where faculty, staff, and students can work in a more humanistic or humane environment. One of the issues about education that has political implications, has economic implications, is the question of whether or not education is a privilege or a right. As a privilege, education serves the interests of those who are in power, those who are wealthy, those who are privileged in society, the members of the dominant group. Their interests are realized. For example, our educational system is largely European and Eurocentric. Another alternative is that education as a right. Education should not only serve the interests of the privileged few, but education should serve the interests of the masses of people in society. You shouldn't have people with power and privilege who have the ability to shove their values and beliefs down the throats of the masses of people, in a word. But rather, our educational system should represent the broad spectrum of people in values in our society. The critical power conflict perspective that we are applying in this course and in this textbook gives us unique insights when it comes to education. Education, from this perspective, is inherently unequal. That we do not all receive the same educational experience and realize the same educational outcomes. That education, in fact, serves the interests of those who are elites in society. That education is more of a privilege than a right in our society. That is particularly the case when it comes to the quality of education. There are strict rules about where your children can attend school based upon where you live. But guess what? People live where they can afford to live. So there is an inherent class bias to our educational system. If you are aware of a school that provides a higher quality of education, this can be very subjective and personal, you are not allowed to do so legally. Actually, there are legal consequences for moving your child from one school district to another. And the basis for that is rooted in our laws regarding desegregation, the desegregation of schools. If we were all allowed to send our kids to any school that we want, we would probably naturally resegregate ourselves. And so that is the basis for those types of laws and restrictions. The underclass, women, and racial minorities are often denied access to quality education in our society. And some of this is class-based, some of this is race-based, some of this is dependent upon the areas in which you live. And there is a significant difference in the quality of education that we receive across the spectrum of schools, colleges, and universities, and professional schools like medical schools, law schools. All of these have some inherently unequal qualities. So there's a distinction between private versus public schools. We see private schools tend to have more resources. They tend to have lower class sizes. Teachers tend to be paid a more competitive wage. They offer more advanced courses. They tend to have facilities like labs and computers and other technologies that enhance the quality of education for students. So there's a public versus private school dichotomy. Suburban versus urban inner city schools. Suburban schools tend to have advantages that inner city schools do not. Inner city schools tend to have fewer resources. They tend to be overcrowded. Teachers tend to be overworked and underpaid, and there are certainly disadvantages when it comes to suburban versus urban inner city schools. And then there's this rural-urban dichotomy. Rural schools tend to have less resources as a rule compared to urban schools. Urban schools, there tends to be an urban bias in our educational system. The history of the inequality within our educational system goes back to its inception. There was a practice in our society referred to as separate but equal education. And this is in quotes because schools have always been separate but not equal. We had a segregated school system under Jim Crow segregation that by law white schools and black schools were separate. This had consequences for children and for families and for society. It was actually shown, it was a study by Kenneth Clark that appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and demonstrated that school segregation actually had a detrimental effect upon black kids. He did an experiment with dolls, and he would show black kids a white doll, a black doll. He would ask which doll is the smart doll, and the kids would choose the white doll. Which doll's the dumb doll, the black doll. Which doll is the pretty doll? The white doll was selected. These are all black children. And then he said, which doll is the ugly doll? And they picked the black doll. And finally, he would say, which doll would you like to more likely to be about? More likely to be like. Would you like to be like? And they said that they would like to be like the white doll. And this provided evidence about how that segregated education taught black kids to be inferior, that they were inferior to whites. And so this is some of the evidence that led to the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka U.S. Supreme Court case that desegregated schools in 1954. There was also a case known as the Bakke case that addressed the issue of affirmative action in professional schools. This is the University of California of Davis. They had never admitted a black to their school, and they admitted a black gentleman who qualified based upon the exams. Bakke sued, who claimed that he was more qualified, that he had scored higher than this student. The U.S. Supreme Court found that race could be used in affirmative action, but it cannot be the only factor. That affirmative action had to give opportunities to qualified minorities, which the black applicant qualified, but Bakke argued that he was more qualified, and that just didn't fly. I mean, we have that case in society today, that there are qualifications for a job like president. You must be 35 years of age, a citizen of the United States, and let's say someone is 45. Are they more qualified than a 35-year-old? No, they're not more qualified. They're just qualified. And so all things being equal, there is subjectivity that goes into decisions, admissions into colleges, universities, hiring and promotion. But when it comes to qualifications, there's really no basis for someone being more qualified or less qualified. You're either qualified or not. So minorities cannot be given opportunities without first being qualified. Educational choice is also an issue that arises when it comes to schools in our society. Typically, our educational opportunities and access to quality education is often limited by one's socioeconomic status. Thus, where you live has an effect upon your choices and your options. Some people argue that school choice leads to resegregation of schools, that we naturally attend schools where the demographics is more like us than a diverse environment. By law, schools are to be desegregated. So it's important that we understand the consequences of school choice. There are also tracking systems in school. In your textbook, it talks about how white students are disproportionately tracked into gifted tracks, where minority children and poor children are more often tracked into remedial classes and are tracked into more vocational education, practical education rather than higher education. These tracking systems within desegregated schools can also perpetuate educational inequalities that have a basis in U.S. history. Testing is a big issue also in education. Testing is used to determine funding for schools. It is a way to assess schools in terms of are they effectively providing instruction to students. It also is used in admissions to colleges, universities, and professional schools. And it's also used to measure intelligence. The rule of the day is that standardized exams are used across the board in society, many of which are designed at Princeton University on the East Coast. They have a Eurocentric bias to them. There are people that tend to perform well on these exams and those that tend to perform not as well on these exams. Among the highest performers on standardized exams are Asians. The exams are in English, but Asians tend to perform better. It's not because Asians have a math and science gene or something, or inherently smarter than others. It's their work ethic. Asians tend to spend more time in study and preparation for exams than other demographics. There are those who perform very well and those who do not perform very well on standardized exams. We also know that standardized exams do not always serve as a measure of a person's potential academic performance. And also there are criticisms concerning whether or not it truly measures intelligence. One of the issues is that we know that there's more than one type of intelligence. And when it comes to quantitative or standardized exams, they only measure very selective factors in terms of intelligence in society. School testing also reinforces stereotypes and have consequences for minorities and women and the underclass in our society. We know for a fact that there are multiple intelligences, and there are many ways to measure one's intelligence and one's potential academic performance at a higher level. For example, when it comes to college admission exams. But the idea of testing is also political because education is inherently political. What is taught, how much money is committed in terms of a state budget or federal budget for education. And so these all have an effect upon what's taught and how it's taught in society. And they're not always the best measure of a person's intelligence. As I said, there are people who have there are multiple factors in terms of intelligence. Howard Gardner proposed that there were 9 types of intelligence in 1983. He is a developmental psychologist. He said that there is a naturalist intelligence, people who are nature smart. There's a musical intelligence. There's a logical mathematical intelligence. There's an existential intelligence, where people simply they're sort of smart when it comes to life. There's interpersonal intelligence. There's bodily kinesthetic intelligence, where people who are athletic. There are people who have linguistic intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, and spatial intelligence. So when it comes to standardized exams, we typically use them as a way to measure a person's intelligence, potential academic performance at a higher level, and there's certainly limitations to these standardized exams, but they have real consequences for people and society. Finally, there's a concept known as educational democracy. And one of the assumptions of educational democracy is that education should reflect our principles of equality, that everyone should have a right to quality education in society. Our academic institution should also represent the diversity of the United States in terms of its faculty, staff, its students. These things should be should reflect who we are as a nation, our principles and our ideas. Women and racial minorities should be proportionally represented in our schools, colleges, and universities as well. That our schools should look like society. And the quality of education should be a right for all, instead of being a privilege of the few. Where one lives, one's ethnic background, one's socioeconomic status should not determine the right to equality education in our society. Let me know if you have any questions. dmonk@sc.edu.